This is Make Planning Make Sense. I'm Aaron and I'm a director at Centro. In this episode, my co-host Alex and I are speaking with Esther Robinson-Wild, founding director at Robinson-Wild, and Darcie Kerr of Robinson-Wild. The conversation was an absolute pleasure, despite working through some of the thorniest issues in heritage and planning. Heritage sits both alongside and within planning, and the similarities in professional dynamics are really quite striking. Evidence, integrity, and experience are all absolutely essential in both professions, and really each of the professions that comprise the built environment sector. A question that emerged from this episode for our audience is what your favorite heritage descriptor, word or phrase, might be. So please do let us know. Please be sure to give the podcast a follow on your preferred platform, recommend a favorite episode or two to your professional network, and continue the conversation on our media channels, MPMS Podcast on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky. Here is our conversation with Esther Robinson-Wild and Darcie Kerr of Robinson-Wild. Esther Robinson-Wild and Darcie Kerr, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
So, Esther, you are the founding director of Robinson-Wild.
That's correct.
It's a really interesting organization, and I don't think that there are that many like it. It would be great to tell the audience all about the firm and how you both came to where you are.
Well, yes, we're a small team of historic environment consultants. We cover the spectrum, really, of the historic environment, mainly in the planning context, but our clients are trying to do something with, historic buildings or sites surrounded by heritage assets. So, yes, we've got a variety of specialisms within our team. So I'm an archaeologist by first degree. I haven't dug a hole in the ground for many years. I do stand on the side of holes, monitoring archaeological conditions for clients, but yes, I haven't wielded a spade for many a year. And buildings archaeology is my most recent sort of academic qualification, so just really taking an archaeological approach to assessing buildings. My background is in real estate finance, so I worked in structured finance for many years, focusing on property and real estate debt. That's why we are different, I think, in terms of what we offer. So we come at it from a bit more of a commercial perspective and trying to understand what clients are trying to achieve, but whilst maintaining that balance of protecting heritage at the same time. And so that's my background. Darcie has joined. Yeah. She's been with us for
almost 2 years now.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm a bit more early careers in my journey, but I joined the Robinson-Wild team about 2 years ago. So my background is in history and more specifically landscape history. So that's another string to our bow in terms of our team. I can really look at things from a setting perspective, and that's kind of what I specialise in. It's been great working with the team and seeing all things about the historic environment, but also planning. We go to lots of kind of planning real estate events, so Women in Property, for example, and I get a full kind of broad spectrum view of what is involved in planning, and it's a lot bigger than I originally thought, which is very interesting.
Yeah. And I suppose we should mention our other colleague, Dr. Tony Griffiths. Tony's been with us almost a year, and her specialism is in community engagement, essentially. So working with community organisations and really understanding what people need from their projects. So that's her particular area.
Lovely, lovely. Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned Women in Property as well. Our colleague Reese is on the committee here for London, as I believe, are you?
I am, yes. Esther? So I've recently joined. It's a matter of weeks.
Congratulations.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much.
That's
I'm very
fantastic.
pleased. I think it's a great organisation. Before I was joined by Darcie and Tony, for me, it's a really good support network, actually. It's really cemented what I thought about how the variety of disciplines within project teams and actually just the built environment, and a really good network of good people to go out and spend time with and learn from as well. That's a big part of it.
And it's a great organisation to attend for events. They let me in, and they always say, actually, we want all of the audience to be as diverse as the industry. It's fantastic as well that there is that space, because I think the industry is based on our listening data. If that's representative, it's sort of 3 to 1.
I think finance and real estate is very much the same.
Lads.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, you mentioned most of the work you do is in planning. What does the work that you do outside of planning look like for heritage?
Thematic studies, actually. I did one years ago for a London borough assessing 20th century assets. A few years ago, there was that whole estates regeneration push. So, yeah, there was that sort of more about portfolio assessment type work, really, not a conceived project being brought forward straight away. I've contributed to a couple of books focusing on thematic studies of Victorian schools, for example, for an organisation called Save Britain's Heritage, which is just down the road. I'm trying to think of other things that we've done. A lot of it is just planning.
Yeah, a lot of it is
Actually, a piece of work that we're doing more of is working with the local authority, where I'm looking at their inward investment strategy. So very much leveraging my finance background. They have quite a lot of ambition around that and attracting investment into the town and the borough. It's a town and a borough with lots of historic buildings. And there's a real focus of using those historic buildings as that catalyst and really being part of the regeneration. So that's a really exciting project for me, because it's really combining both heritage and finance and thinking about that strategic advice piece.
A local authority can be the owner of a lot of the landmark buildings that make a community what it is in a built term, like the baths or the leisure centre or whatever it might be. And those can be really expensive to renovate or to find a viable purpose for.
Absolutely. And I think we're finding that a lot of local authorities not necessarily knowing what to do with all their assets to get the best out of their assets. And I think that's where we find that work really interesting, especially with Esther's background in real estate finance. You can get viable uses out of these assets, and it's working out kind of where there might be constraints, but actually where you can work around those constraints and get what you need. And that's certainly an aspect of work that is quite exciting.
It challenges that sort of notion that viability and heritage conservation need to be at odds, that there needs to be a continuum and they're on opposite sides. But it also sounds like that's a really important niche part of the market that you're able to fill.
Yeah.
When we talk about heritage and planning, sometimes it's a little bit more academic than commercially minded, or academic and I guess commercially minded. I'm not crazy about the term because it just sounds like Wolf of Wall Street.
Yes. Yeah. It just makes you think of money.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? Yeah.
What's your experience been on the planning side, where a planning officer or a different member of a different development team might bring a more maybe siloed perspective on heritage?
That's a good question. It ties into that sort of new piece of work we're starting with the inward investment strategy. Before being taken on board, I had to have a really sort of honest discussion with the local authority to say, we can do all of this work. We can look at buildings that could act as that catalyst of change. But your planning people have to be on board with this, because it could be all for nothing if we can't get it through the planning. So that was really interesting at sort of a strategic level, that we've got to get that buy-in and work together collaboratively. And that came from our day-to-day experience. It's very varied what you're going to get. Even though we have a planning policy framework and local planning policies, and you think that's the decision-making framework, there's huge amounts of inconsistency, isn't there? It differs wherever we go in the country, which is probably your experience as well. But it's just trying to work with people, just have to engage early. I think that's the thing. Being respectful of the role that conservation officers, planning officers have in the process. They're important. We've got to engage early with them. It's really important actually to have these frank conversations. We see it often from a planning perspective, even with potential clients, and they say, can we do this? And if the answer is no, we just tell them, look, I'm really sorry, we can't give you better news, but we're not going to take your money to waste everyone's time.
Exactly. And that's incredibly important, being frank early on, because you don't want to waste, as you say, anyone's time, but also money. It's understanding your context, and once you have that really good understanding early on, you can then give that advice early on, even hopefully sometimes pre-acquisition, so you are then always on the best foot. Early engagement is something we really try and push for, because it's proven to save people time and money and hassle.
Absolutely.
And I think on that as well, if you don't have that honest conversation up front, it also looks like you can't do your job properly, because they're not going to get the result they want. For me, that's how I view it anyway. Technically, in their eyes, we failed, but they were always set up for failure because it was never realistic. So I wouldn't put myself in that process. It's about helping them navigate it in a much more positive way, because there should be a way around that and helping them get something out of it. It's just not going to be what they initially think.
Fair. Bit of tough love.
Yes.
Yeah. Sometimes I think that people might picture sort of tucking their pearls in, like, oh my goodness, like, they've just been so direct. But I think that is respectful in the right circumstance, for sure. Yeah. And I think it's disrespectful even not to be in those circumstances as well.
And
So-
I think with heritage, there is this thing that's all quite nice and, cosy. It's old stuff. It's lovely, isn't it? I think that's a harder thing as well, coming from that perspective that it's not a hard-nosed discipline, shall we say, because it's just talking about nice old things.
Just lovely old things.
Yeah, bits falling off them generally.
Window reveals and
Well, exactly.
single glazing.
Sash windows.
It sounds like getting the best out of an asset came quite naturally to you with your previous experience in finance. Broadly speaking, for a lot of consultants or conservation officers, do you think that's missing in terms of skill set? Or
I would say yes, to put it
leading questions.
kindly. Yeah, I think that's definitely the case, and that's something we have experienced, because whatever project we take on, we want the best for the asset. That's always number one. Clients are often willing to work with you to get the best for both, because you want a positive outcome. And I think you do have to be more open-minded to really get the best out of an asset, because if you're taking a very hardline approach, we do see issues with if it's old, it's got to stay, or equating kind of because something's old, it's really significant, when actually that's not always the case. That can really limit your options and then limit what's best for the building as well. And then you're stuck in a cycle of not being able to get plans through. And it kind of perpetuates that idea that heritage buildings are difficult, which they aren't when you got the right advice early on. And I think if more people viewed it in that way, in that open-minded way, that you've got to get a good viable use from the building and you kind of have to work together with that viability and heritage hand in hand, then we'd see a lot more positive outcomes and more people would be willing to take on heritage buildings.
Yeah.
So it would kind of go full circle then.
The MPPF talks about securing its optimum viable use for a heritage asset. I would say often there's frequently cases where that's overlooked, where that intercept between a viable operation and the sort of ideal. Right? We don't want this old church to become a block of flats. We want it to become a light-filled community library, a cafe and garden. And it's like, yeah, me too, right? How do we solve for the disconnect that does seem to come up quite frequently?
So I was thinking about this a few weeks ago at an event where the topic turned to community engagement and understanding what the local community want from a development. It was quite interesting because my feeling is that there is an absence of those frank conversations with the local community. But I think it would be worthwhile saying, this is a commercial venture. We have acquired this site or this building and we're investing in it. So there is an economic value that we see in this. And within the realms of possibility and, everything that we've got to consider behind us, funding and all the rest of it, we think we can get this on this site. What do you think? And I think it's sort of a meeting in the middle, maybe, and managing expectations, but also being realistic with people. Because I think there is this sort of developers, awful, they're just there to sort of just like drain it, get the value and that's it. Yet that's not necessarily the case. So I think bridging that gap of unrealistic, let's have this beautiful light-filled community cafe, but actually we've got 5 cafes just around the corner and half of them are empty most of the time. Just saying, look, these are the boundaries in which we can do something and we probably could get community use in here. What do you need realistically? And then we probably can deliver on that, but it's going to be part of this bigger, scheme that we're doing.
Yeah. And it reminds me actually of the conversation we had with Ollie Sargent at Cartwright, who does a lot of work with community engagement. And he made a similar point, which was that you have to be upfront about what the boundaries of the conversation are. That helps rein in the really off-the-wall consultation responses that you have to discount anyway, because it's not going to be a roller rink or whatever. But then actually build that trust with that community member.
Yep.
Communities might feel that people who don't live there are coming in and developing it and they don't have an idea of what the community needs or wants. But if you are honest and frank right away and you kind of say, well, these are our parameters, this is what we need, but we are also willing to work with you because we understand you've got to use this building or live around it, then I think building that respect early on, which then goes hand in hand with the trust, would make a big difference.
Yeah.
And also looking to community organisations and not-for-profits who have taken on historic buildings. So Architectural Heritage Fund is a charity. It's our 50th anniversary next year. And they have a whole bank of case studies that I really recommend. Everywhere I go, I tell people to look at their websites and case studies. There are multiple towns and cities where buildings and organisations have benefited from funding from the Architecture Heritage Fund. And it really does bring about quite a lot of change. One building can really make a difference. So I think there's a lot to learn from those organisations that have taken that step. But it's also, talking back to the viability, you're going to have value and derive indirect value from those organisations who are already doing something further down the high street. There's buy-in and multiple funders on these buildings. Local authority should be engaged with that as well. Those projects have to derive income that keep the lights on. It does work. There's a really good project in Redruth in Cornwall called The Ladder. They've taken an old Victorian library. It's a Passmore Edwards library. Passmore Edwards was a philanthropist. He went around giving money for libraries to empower people through books and education. I think it's wonderful.
Oh, I love it.
So Passmore Edwards, and he's got all these libraries. I think there's a few in London as well. And what they've done there, they've been really, really clever, I think. So they've got this building. It's going to cost some money. They are a cultural and arts-focused organisation. So they've got a nursery on a 10-year lease or so. So that's their anchor tenant. It's brilliant. That allows them to go a bit slower in trying to get the building back into use for what their main focus is. But there's a load of kids engaging with heritage. You know, it's just brilliant. And it wasn't a very complicated fit out. They used a portion of the building. But that, for me, is amazing because you're just getting that accessibility, but really clever. Let's get some income in, and it's good solid income for 10 years or so.
That's terrific.
Yep.
That links to that rise in meanwhile spaces we're seeing as well. What can you do with an asset early on to get that income generated straight away? And I think that's something we're definitely seeing. Meanwhile space is becoming more popular before a long-term solution is found.
Going back to sort of the beginning of this and talking about siloed thought and things from the decision makers, it's difficult, even though it's really demonstrably a good thing that's happening here. I've got two projects in my mind that I can think of in a particular part of the country where it's volunteer-led, average age of about 80. They're wonderful. A crematorium opened up a few years ago, so they're now the place to go to for funeral teas. It's brilliant. It's a great 2-star heritage asset, and they're sort of providing funeral teas in a freezing cold, horrible old marquee, and they're doing this wonderful event space. And it has been very, very challenging trying to get this over the line. It's not impactful to significance at all. Even though on the surface, it's like, this should be an easy win at planning. It's been quite a struggle, but we've got there. Yeah. With the planning, I think MPPF does not, when it talks about the heritage values going towards significance, it doesn't talk about communal value, which Historic England do in their conservation principle. And it just talks about public benefit, doesn't it? That's the thing. So they'll go, okay, public benefit. But I think they're missing a trick because the communal value is really key. And I think increasingly we are looking at projects where that's actually a really important value that contributes to significance. So as planning consultants, how do you think we can fix this?
Well,
question back to you.
It's quite interesting that for all the frustrations we have with the MPPF and the way that you can really read it to land at whatever kind of answer you want, that sounds like an example of how, despite all of its wishy-washiness, it actually is scoping out something that is kind of a no-brainer for a community benefit, being a heritage benefit, being a synergistic commercial benefit, even if it's just the pensioners serving sandwiches. So how would I'm a big believer in changing the structure of a process and that the culture in that field will follow from it. So I think that primary legislation might be the starting point, but that's like the absolute most difficult thing to do.
I just put you on the spot. What do you think?
And the answer is what needs to change everything. We will be right back.
There's like two layers there as well. There's maybe a certain degree of subjectivity within that dynamic with the conservation officer, and then that siloed thinking where the conservation officer perhaps and every other officer is thinking about their particular area of expertise and not necessarily thinking about the planning balance overall.
I have been sat in a client meeting with Historic England where an architect turned to the Historic England representative and said, you just make this up as you go along. I've never seen a client. So I was sat next to the Historic England representative, and I was insulted by that as well. You're saying we all make it up. It was an interesting play by the architect on the scheme to do that directly in front of their client, who was wanting to have, it was a very sensitive site, loads of heritage assets. So we needed HE. You know, we need to be friends. I think that was quite a high point in my career in finance. Like that's a good way of going around to make friends. How do we deal with the silo? I've jumped in here, Darcie, so you might have some thoughts, but we provide objective assessments. As an old mentor of mine used to say, we're not hired guns, because it doesn't serve anyone's purpose. We work in a very small sector. People are aware of each other. We would lose credibility. It would be very obvious if we did that. So the objective assessment comes in that we do look at conservation principles, MPPF. A lot of it is skills and experience and best practice, I think, in that to come to, a conclusion. But there is a subjectivity around heritage and what people, I'm a fan of 20th century buildings. I'm part of one of the committees at the 20th Century Society just down the road, whereas other people would just happily get rid of anything from the 50s and 60s. So there is a subjectivity around that, but we have to just get to the most objective assessment.
Yeah, and I think that links to a really good thorough evidence base, and that's what we present in our work and our reports, is an evidence base of where the significance lies. There's always subjectivity, which is really difficult to iron out, but you always have to draw it back to the research, the facts, and how we set it out and how you present the significance.
It's difficult because we are dealing with buildings of hundreds of years old sometimes, and there isn't a little nice folder somewhere that says it was constructed in this year and
this is why.
Yeah, but then that's where that sort of builders archaeology comes in, the landscape. It's the suitably skilled and experienced element of the project team.
There might be sort of a diagrammatic triangle where you've got experience, integrity, and evidence. And no matter which corner of the triangle you look at, you're thinking, that's not complete.
I really like that. Can I use that? Please, let's get back there. That's, essentially it, really.
Because they all need to work together as one to present that kind of firm basis,
From the planning side of things, I don't think it's revolutionary at all to say that the industry has a general consensus that experience is not where we want it to be in terms of the overlay of career pipelines that will form an organization. So many times we will say to the officer, look, we get it. We'll not just make this point to you on this call, but we'll also work with the team to prepare whatever it is, a section, a drawing, a diagram, just so you have the evidence in the evidence base. And to quote Laurie Hancock at ICINI, who was on for episodes 5 and 6, that is a removal of anxiety.
Yeah.
Well, everyone knows what you're dealing with. There's a level playing field then, isn't there?
Yeah, because there's the committee gauntlet and then there's the JR risk, and nobody wants to be the person on whom it falls back. They can say, well, actually, there's a drawing number, blah, 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 that demonstrates this. And the planning record almost becomes overly complete for that very purpose. So for heritage and planning, integrity, evidence, and experience, all three seem to be required at so many different stages of the process. Even starting with identifying whether a site is in the setting of a heritage asset, the significance of that heritage asset. And then you get to harm. So going back to your question, like, how would you change it? How do I think about what could be better about it? I think that the harm versus public benefit exercise is probably the wrong thing that we should be asking ourselves. Maybe instead of harm, it's the value of the change.
I do think MPPF wording is really unhelpful because what we find is that decision makers talk about harm, less than substantial or substantial, whereas actually planning practice guidance contemplates you can have no harm. The significance cannot be harmed. We talk about it in our reports, but a decision maker will be going, well, I've got to choose one of the two. And so it's less than substantial. Well, you can have no harm here. The significance is maintained and that's fine. And I think that talks to that setting thing as well, that actually you've got a site or a building within the setting of a heritage asset, conservation area or anything. So when you think about the significance behind a conservation area, there'll be a variety of factors to that. when you sort of put your site within that context, that's only a very small part of it. So it's really understanding what is important about it and making that connection and going, well, what I want to do over here is not going to affect where the significance lies over there, and there's no harm. I think MPPF is just really unhelpful in that, because it's just, well, I've got to make a decision less than substantial. And it's like, okay, fine. But there's no harm, really.
Yeah.
This is the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you've probably seen this when dealing with householders or privately owned assets where there's no public access or anything, and someone's building an extension or something. Well, there's no public benefit. Well, okay. And you've got to sort of say, well, the asset's continuing to be used and conserved, so there is a benefit to that. But you do feel a bit sort of, that's very weak, actually. But that's the accepted way to deal with that response in that scenario, isn't it?
Yeah, there definitely needs to be a kind of investigation setting out that public benefit, because it can be used in a really effective way. You might be able to do more with the building because you can demonstrate that it's going to have really clear public benefit. But as you say, the lines are too blurred, so there needs to be greater definitions. A phrase as big as public benefit is quite broad.
And within harm as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that for people in the planning profession who think that the relationship between an applicant and LPA is the game and that the game is the point. So there's the cat and mouse thing. I actually used to work with somebody who is now at a local authority, and we were catching up a few years after we parted ways professionally. And she said, look, it's simple. You want something and we don't want to give it to you. And I was like, why don't you want to give it to us?
It's just so at odds with, especially in heritage, people go into the industry because they have a love of heritage. That's where people come from. You want to see an asset being used for its longevity. I think that's where it's really difficult, that people forget actually for a lot of the time we're all coming from a very similar basis and we share the same kind of ground view, that actually, no, we do want to see something positive. And I think, as you say, that kind of cat and mouse game can maybe overtake, actually, we'll generally have a shared kind of base ethos.
The shared ethos is the bigger picture.
Exactly.
I think.
I would add one more point to your triangle, maybe, which is like
a square,
which is like institutional ways of thinking, culture. As you were saying, you can have no harm, right? You put all the evidence together, you put all the material considerations together, and you put forward your really robust interpretation. But then sometimes you're up against, well, that's not how we see it, and that's not how we do things here.
I think going back, it's the evidence base. So I think our starting point is that we're aware that they're under-resourced, they're under pressure. The conservation officers, they do have a wealth of knowledge about their local area as well. So they enormously helpful. We're working with one local authority and it's brilliant. It's a proper partnership. We are absolutely trying to get use out of buildings that make us sad when we walk past them because they're empty. Local people, when you're standing there looking at them, they're like, oh, something happening. It's brilliant. It's like, right, this is it. But I think it's our job to assist them in saying, we are on your side. We're trying to achieve the same things here. And it's just providing them with that really good, robust understanding. So it works two ways, I think. It's saying, we actually know this better than you because we have the time, not because of an arrogant, we don't say that directly to them, but we communicate through the power of heritage statements that, although, to be honest, there are times when we produce ridiculously long documents and they go, and another thing, and you go, oh, I'm now creeping up to 150 pages. This is for planning, this is madness. But we do it. I think this is part of that. So to say, look, hopefully give you assurance. We do know what we're doing here. But I think it also contextualises that this is the basis on which our client is bringing this proposal forward. So it's informed, and what they are now presenting to you in the planning application comes from us working together, oftentimes with, good conservation officer who wants to be involved because they do want something good to happen. Everyone benefits from that. But yeah, it's really interesting, actually, the dynamics. Sometimes planning officer will be a stronger character than the conservation officer. And the conservation officer, like, oh, I really back them. They're great because I want to help them have that voice, and it's just that dynamic's not working. And then the other time, conservation officer is such a strong character. Planning officer does stand a chance. I say to people, our job is a big part is just people management.
People management, yeah.
Navigating the world. We don't wax lyrical on that. That's the thing. So it even comes down to language. In the introduction of our reports, others will say, this report has been prepared to support the application. I never write that. Ours is a standalone objective assessment. So our involvement and our report being there is implicit that we're on board with this. And our impact assessments, we analyse it that objective way. We will do a narrative around actually where we think there's a good thing. So did a project recently where highly significant fabric was being removed, but it was the only way to get this new use for a community organisation in this building. So had to state, this is harmful to highly significant fabric, but it's the only way to get this space used. And so I had to talk to that. They are trying to do a good thing, but it's still being very careful about language that doesn't tip into overall, they're great.
And I think you can also state being quite factual. So if you've had discussions with the local authority and then the project team have gone back and redesigned based on that feedback and tried to make the proposal more sympathetic, then we can talk to that because that's factual. And that, I think that kind of signals that the client or the applicant is making the correct and right steps. It's always factual, but there are positive things you can do.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And I'm hearing the feedback loop with evidence back to integrity again as well.
Yeah.
Can I ask kind of like a fun one?
Yeah, go for it.
So, Esther, you mentioned terminology, right? I want to kind of overlay that with the terminology used sometimes in planning, especially through the consultation process. Words like jarring, incongruous, alien. And sometimes it's like because it's going to be 2 stories taller, but like in central London. And you're like, this isn't serious. The bombast of the terminology. How do we talk openly about that? How do we maybe explore that?
I love that question because I'm a word geek. I am absolutely fascinated by how people use language and words. And it's just, I read some of these and I go, this is too good. This is so good. Because, I very recently had to write a response to a pre-app where a consultee had just used really subjective language and sort of it's dominant, and I like definitions. So what I do is I understand the definition. For example, dominant would be, it's now the primary feature within your view. That is simply incorrect because, exactly. I'm like, great, that's one. So next. So I love it because it goes back to the evidence base and withstanding scrutiny. And you have to use professional language. You have to just think about the words you're using because it doesn't withstand that. These words are amazing and you just think, please just reread it. So for me, it's about stuff like that. But, generally the client comes back and goes, oh, great, thanks for that. And I'm like, I enjoyed myself. I sat there with a cup of tea and just went through it. It was fun.
Do either of you have a favourite townscape or impact descriptor? As in like a favourite, least favourite? For me, jarring, incongruous, alien, those are like my favourite because they don't actually ever really speak to how they've been used in the documentation that I'm reading.
It's not a particular word, but it's sometimes some responses we've seen where they have actually put, I think, or in brackets, in my opinion. And I think, that maybe in your opinion, but then it's kind of just left hanging. It's not linked to because X, Y, Z. And I kind of think,
But generally stuff like that, it's really dramatic language. That's the thing. It's really dramatic sometimes. And you're just thinking, okay, that's a bit, overexcited about what is a proposed extension to a Victorian rectory, really.
Yeah.
But
you were sort of alluding to a tone thing as well, Darcie, right? Like in my view. And that can either mean, guys, it's just in my view, in my humble view, or it could be like, this is really terrible. At least I think so anyway.
yes.
yes,
It's more that.
That's
the thing. And we're on the receiving end of all of this, that when you are dealing with canyon effect and jarring and stuff, you go back and go, well, here's a picture of a canyon.
Canyon effect is
This is not happening, this urban
It's
centre.
a trough at
Yeah.
most.
please.
You go back with similar language of like, yes, it's a trough and it's not,
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just patience. You have to come back to it with patience.
Definitely.
But I like that you're like, but actually I looked up what jarring means.
Yeah. Well, I don't actually write in. I've looked at the definition. I sort of weave the actual definition within it.
Just sort of like a humble,
Yeah,
like,
sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm just going to
then,
put...
yeah, I don't go that because I was like, that's just bragging. So I just weave it in, just weave it in there, and just, and just it's how I get my fun.
No, it's fantastic. And shout out to my mum, who's an English teacher.
Oh, right. Which is important. You should do answers on a postcard, I think you get quite an interesting...
Yeah.
Write in, what is your favourite heritage descriptor? Phrases are accepted. At MP, MS Podcast, Esther Robinson Wild and Darcie Kerr of Robinson Wild. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for hosting us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Make Planning Make Sense. Please do give the show a follow, and please share the show to keep the conversation going and the community growing. Find us on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at MPMS Podcast, or write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Additional production by my colleague and co-host, Alex Roth. Marketing and promotion by our colleague, Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague, Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thanks again for listening.